Now, the International Court of Justice, the world's top court, of course, issued a historic ruling last week. This was a advisory opinion, but what that means in practice is how the top world's judges understand international law, what international law says. And it's on the question of Israel's occupation of Palestine, which is the longest belligerent occupation in modern times. And this is at the request of the UN General Assembly at the end of 2022. So they were asked to do this before the current horrors began, of course, last October. Now, there's no better person for me to just talk this through than the brilliant Ambassador Majed Bamya, who is Deputy Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine at the United Nations. So a very long-standing Palestinian diplomat based in New York. Firstly, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
Good to see you. We've known better times, but hopefully better times are ahead.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, well, we'll talk about that. One of the things I think I'm going to talk to you about is the way public opinion has shifted in many of the states which support and arm Israel, and the implications that has for an often very lonely fight that you and your other fellow diplomats have been fighting over the last few years. I just want to start actually just by talking about your role there. The United Nations, of course, represents supposedly all the states that exist in the world. Palestine has been denied full statehood. In fact, the United States used its veto on the Security Council to stop a bid for Palestine to get full statehood. Could you just explain, being a diplomat in these circumstances, just tell us about your role. What's it like being a diplomat in New York, having to make the case for Palestinian rights when you're up against a state with, let's be honest, which has the power and patronage of the world's only superpower, as well as other powerful states? Just like, what are the difficulties, the challenges you have to face?
So, when you're a diplomat, your role is to represent your country's position and interests. In the case of a Palestinian diplomat, you have the added weight of representing a national cause and being faced with repeated tragedies. The worst one maybe in our modern history being the one unfolding today in Gaza. And when we are at the UN, there's a battle of narratives. That's part of our role, to present the evidence, the facts, the arguments, in the hope to shift mentalities within the UN and among governments, but also among public opinions, because these expressions are public. There's also the role of legislating in order to preserve the rights of the Palestinian people and to preserve the essentials for a just and lasting peace, which is ending occupation and the freedom for the Palestinian people, and avoid those who are trying to tamper with the rules of international law or adapt them to the illegality, instead of ensuring that the illegality ends in order to uphold the rules. And this is a place where you can mobilize the world as a whole. But of course, as you said, not all players have the same rights in these forums, and some tend to abuse some of the rights that are given to them because of historical reasons. Our membership bid was blocked by a veto, despite having overwhelming support in the Security Council. And the answer came from the General Assembly, where 143 UN member states called on the Security Council to reverse its decision, meaning that the country that used the veto no longer resorts to the veto, and that Palestine be welcomed as a member state with equal rights to all other in the international community, as a contribution to ending occupation and having just and lasting peace in the Middle East.
And actually, before I ask you about the International Court of Justice, it can be, I mean, you make a really important point there, that we can overstate, I suppose, the weakness relatively of Palestine, because actually most of the world's countries recognize Palestine as a state. And we've just recently seen Spain, Ireland and Norway recognize Palestine as a state. So, I mean, there is actually, I know the US is the world's hegemon, but Palestine has been recognized by most states, hasn't it?
It has been by a huge number of countries. Over 3/4 of the world countries have recognized us, and the last ones to have recognized us are, as you said, Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia. And just before that, Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago. And then Armenia also recognized the state of Palestine more recently. So this is the last of several waves of recognition, because countries are conscious that this is an injustice, a profound injustice, that the Palestinian people have been deprived of the right to self-determination, including the right to their independent state, that nothing can justify such a prolonged deprivation of an entire nation of their right to life, to liberty, of dignity, and therefore they want to contribute, and recognition is one of the forms of contribution required. The second is to advance accountability and upholding the rules of international law, including holding accountable the country that has kept us in shackles for so long.
The International Court of Justice, let's just talk about that ruling. So Israel's defenders will go, advisory opinion, it's not legally binding, doesn't matter. What would you say when they say that?
Apparently, nothing is legally binding. The Charter, the UN Charter, which is supposed to be one of the most important documents ever produced by humanity, the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, of course, use advisory opinion, but that's an authoritative opinion. What does it mean, advisory opinion? It just means it's not a contentious case. It's not a case between two states that have recognized the jurisdiction of the court simply because Israel refuses to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the court. It means that the General Assembly is asking the court, guide us, what does the law say? And so we're asking the highest court in the land to tell us what international law says. And international law is binding. And therefore, the interpretation of how that law applies to a specific case by the highest court has authority. So there's no contortion there. And our right to self-determination that the court relied on is in the Charter. It is a peremptory norm of international law, one of the most fundamental norms on which our international law-based order relies. And so countries have an option. Either they are ready to sacrifice all these rules, all these lessons of history that we translated into rules, all the institutions that we built to protect these rules, and accept the Israeli narrative that all of this is simply anti-Semitism, that the ICJ is anti-Semitic, that the ICC is anti-Semitic, that the General Assembly is anti-Semitic, that the Security Council is anti-Semitic, that the Human Rights Council is anti-Semitic, that the ICRC is anti-Semitic, that the UN agencies are anti-Semitic, that the Secretary General is anti-Semitic. Or we can accept that this is the way for Israel to try to evade the law, to project itself as a state above the law. And what we've always repeated is, if you allow that, if you allow Israel for any reason to be a state above the law, it will continue conducting itself as an outlaw state. And so, no, what the ICJ says is based on binding rules. And we heard countries trying to evade their obligations by contesting Security Council resolutions, even, not only the ICJ advisory opinion, saying, is a resolution binding or not? So we have to draw a line. This is the time. Given what happened in Gaza, we know what is the price of giving a pass to countries from upholding the rules of international law. And this opinion places the entire international community, not only Israel, in front of their obligations and what they need to do under international law as obligations they committed themselves to, and that they need to apply to Israel as they would do in other situations.
Let's talk about that ICJ ruling then. I mean, what, for you, what is the most, I mean, was it what you expected? I mean, the reason I say that is actually I noticed people I've interviewed who are experts on international law, and they were surprised actually at how far the ruling went, and actually the number, you know, the fact that many of the rulings were near unanimous, but also all of the rulings had a massive majority. I think 12-4 was the narrowest margin.
11-4 and 12-3.
Sorry, 11-4. Of course, it's 15. Sorry, my math's terrible there. What for you is I mean, just overall, before we talk about some of the specifics, what's the most important significance that represents a kind of departure that moves this along, that is most important for Palestinian claims for justice? What's the kind of key? This is what's fundamentally now has changed.
So the heart of the resolution, and I think some are misrepresenting it, is not that settlements are illegal, because, I mean, that has been repeated, including by this court before. It's important. It's part of the advisory opinion. But the heart of the advisory opinion is that the occupation itself the occupation as a whole on the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is illegal. And once you say that, once you say it's an internationally wrongful act, you say that the obligation is to bring it to an end. And the court has added to that as rapidly as possible. It means that we should all mobilize immediately in order to bring this occupation to an end as rapidly as possible. This is the most important element, and then we can discuss how it arrived to that conclusion based on a lot of illegalities that surrounded this occupation and that show that its very purpose was illegal.
I mean, this is a kind of critical point, isn't it? This is about the annexation, isn't it? I mean, this is, so let's talk about that. This point about annexation and what the court found when it came to annexation.
So you have two pillars on which the court based its opinion, and a third extremely important element. The two pillars is what Israel is doing is annexation in violation of the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, which is a principle that has its reflection in the UN Charter, which is a key principle in the modern era, the post-Second World War era, and that we absolutely need to uphold. So they're seeing that what Israel is doing is to try to create an irreversible reality through the settlements, through the infrastructure, through the demolition of homes, through all these policies and practices with the aim to seize the land unlawfully, to take over the land and integrate it to the territory of Israel. And the court is crystal clear in determining that we have a situation of annexation of large parts of the OPT. The second pillar on which it will reach the conclusion that there's illegality of the occupation is the denial of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which is also enshrined in the UN Charter, which is also a critical principle for the world as we know it. And therefore, these are among the two greatest violations that you can be responsible of. And then there's a third element that the court is looking at, which are the violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and notably in a discriminatory manner. And it reaches a conclusion that what Israel is doing violates Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And the Article 3 pertains to and condemns racial segregation and or apartheid, and calls to eradicate, to prevent, to prohibit, and eradicate such practices. I mean, all of these have been discussed, debated. There's a lot of evidence out there from the UN, from civil society, Israeli, Palestinian, international, including among the most respected institutions and bodies. But having the highest court make determinations on these aspects, on these fundamental aspects, tells you the level of illegality that was reached by Israel. And the court did not yet have to look in this situation on genocide, because the question these questions were posed in a different context, and it has a case that was brought by South Africa to look into genocide, so that is happening in parallel. So you're talking about the worst, the most serious violations that we can imagine in our humanity, fundamental rules that are being breached, and the court therefore concludes that not only the policies and practices are illegal, but an occupation that is annexationist, that aims to deprive a nation of its right to self-determination, is by itself illegal. And therefore, it's not enough to end the settlements or to end the discrimination or the violations of human rights. You need to end the occupation itself, because itself is illegal.
So this includes, when we talk about settlements, which that's already been determined that they violate the Geneva Conventions.
Yes.
But what we're discussing here is, so incentives are provided for Israeli citizens to settle the West Bank, as well as a land policy of favoring Israelis over Palestinians, and that occupying powers have an obligation to provide sufficient resources to an occupied power, that Israel's use of natural resources is inconsistent with its obligations under international law because it diverts those resources to settlers and to Israeli civilians.
Yes, so what you have, the rules that we have, whether the Charter or even IHL rules that define the laws of occupation, they aim at avoiding a phenomena that is well known, that was there before the Second World War and after the Second World War, and that humanity was aiming to bring to an end, which is colonialism.
Yeah.
And occupation has rules governing it, but colonialism is completely prohibited. And the reality of how Israel has conducted its occupation is evidently colonial in nature. And so the court is looking at some of these practices from the forcible transfer of Palestinians, the disposition and displacement of the population, and at the transfer of Israel's own population into the occupied territory, which is considered a war crime under the Geneva Convention. And Israel tries to bring in a religious explanation uh, to the settlements enterprise, to that colonization of land. But that's not how the law applies. It is not based on your religion. It's not based on your religion or origin that we're looking at. We're looking at your nationality and the land and how it is attributed. So people could say, well, Nazareth is in Israel, and the Palestinian population is Muslim and Christian, and therefore Nazareth, given its significance, should be in the Palestinian state. And then again, based on other historical claims, you would redraw the borders of all the countries in the world based on these kind of elements. So we have to abide by the law, and again, not granting a pass and not accepting a narrative that would change the rules based on the identity of the perpetrators of violations or of the victims of these violations. So the court was extremely clear in denouncing the settlement activity, but also all the policies around it. The demolition of homes, whether for punitive reasons or for using the fact that people lack permits. And the court shows that if it's punitive, then this is collective punishment against entire families and communities. That is illegal. That's a war crime, even though the court does not use the criminal law language. But I'm adding that layer. It looks at the lack of permits and says, well, yeah, the settlers can get permits all the time, and the Palestinians almost never get permits. So it's not true that this is an administrative or technical issue. This is clearly with the aim to seize the land. This is clearly about acquisition of land by force. So it dismisses the Israeli pretexts for their violations, including including the chief pretext. The chief pretext that is used by Israel to any concern is security. Security. Whatever you say, this is about security. I have to take over the Jordan Valley for security reasons. I have to displace communities for security reasons. I have to bomb Gaza into oblivion for security reasons. And the court says these are fundamental rules. You cannot use security as a reason to violate such fundamental rules of international law, the right of a nation to self-determination, the prohibition on annexation. So it's also very important to understand how international law functions, or any country can say, yes, I will take over the land, I will violate the rights of entire nations because my security so requires. And we are all entitled to security. The Palestinian people is entitled to security. And the way to provide such security is to uphold international law.
So, I mean, one example is East Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem being treated as sovereign capital, including East Jerusalem, which obviously has been annexed by Israel, where you have where Palestinians are treated, there's an inhospitable environment. And so the point they're making is Palestinians are treated as foreigners. So that's the indigenous population. But legally, Israel is treating them as foreigners and extending its own law into settlements. And that brings them under Israel's permanent control. And this is what, I mean, they said, obviously, so either it's racial discrimination or apartheid. Obviously, many of us, I would be one of them, would say, that's just apartheid. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, will call this apartheid. But can you kind of flesh this out, the kind of apartheid, how this judgment, I know it's either or, but how it fleshes out that this is the crime of apartheid?
So the court, first of all, only places itself in the occupied Palestinian territory and the 1967 borders. So it did not look at the situation within Israel. We believe that racial segregation and apartheid occurred on both sides of the Green Line with very different situations, but still a situation of hostility and negation of rights for the Palestinian people as a whole, because of what you're describing, including that the Israeli narrative has always contested our presence, denying our very existence, denying the fact we are Palestinians, and even the fact that they've dispossessed us and displaced us from the land. Until recently, where they, the fundamentalists in Israel found no problem in saying that there was an Nakba and they just want to repeat it or take it to its term, confessing to what we have been denouncing for decades about what Israel had done in 1948 in order to establish its state, which is dispossess and displace the indigenous population that was there. So that the court examines these legislation and measures that discriminate against the Palestinian people because they belong to the Palestinian group within the occupied Palestinian territory, and it arrives to a conclusion that it is systemic, that you can find this discrimination in a systemic manner across a number of policies and legislation that the court examines, including the 2018 Jewish nation state law, which speaks of promoting settlements, which speaks of the self-determination for Jews only, and which completely denies the existence of the Palestinians as a group, as a people entitled and endowed with certain inalienable rights. So I hope that countries now who have been, fighting the word apartheid and its use, or fighting the words racial segregation, because the court does not decide which one of them is being committed or both of them is being committed, but at least it says one of them at least is being committed. I hope that the countries that spent a lot of effort denying racial segregation apartheid, instead of putting effort to bring it to an end, will now look these realities in the eyes and start acting to change these realities instead of caring about the vocabulary and the feeling that Israel might have around this vocabulary.
A really important point too, and it's important to make this point because it's come up a lot. Obviously, the court, what it sets out focuses on the West Bank, but it has also definitively settled the question of the status of Gaza. That as per international law, Gaza was under Israeli occupation prior to 7th of October. So the disengagement, the withdrawal of the Israeli military back in the mid-2000s, that's often presented as the end of Israeli occupation. So you can just explain that, what the court, what that means, the significance of that you don't have, occupation is not simply defined by all your soldiers there, but the control you exert over a territory, and that qualifies under international law as an occupation.
Yes, you are right. The opinion speaks of the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory and examines the situation in Gaza and conclude that what is relevant is, did you keep effective control over that territory? And given Israel's control on the land borders, on the sea, on the maritime space, on the as well as in the airspace, effectively Israel has remained an occupying power in Gaza without interruption, and that is even more true after the 7th of October, where now the Israeli military is heavily present in occupied Gaza Strip. So all of the territory is occupied, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and the occupation needs to end on the entirety of the territory. The court is very clear in mentioning on the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory, the occupation is illegal and must be brought to an end. And therefore, the court is placing itself also within the legislation by the Security Council and the General Assembly of a two-state solution on the 67 borders. And that's the international consensus. And just to go back on the historical claims, the Palestinian people have had continued presence in the land of Palestine over millennia. And they have a historical claim, they have connection. I have a family home in Jaffa, in Jaffa, as we say in Palestine. My father was born in Jaffa. I'm a refugee from Jaffa. And therefore, the statehood issue, the borders issue, is a different one from the connection that exists to the land, or from the rights that are bestowed on individuals or on groups like the refugees or like the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. They have rights, and that's different from the issue of statehood. And therefore, if the Palestinians are able to accept a two-state solution, despite that very strong historical claim, and despite this history of brutal dispossession, then the same should be expected from Israel. If the world came to us saying, you have to accept the solution, this is the only way forward, and they've spent all this effort and all this pressure to convince us to accept, how come now they can accept that we have an Israeli government who says, I will not accept a Palestinian state, I will destroy that Palestinian state, I refuse to make peace with Palestine, I'll even vote in the Israeli Knesset with absolute overwhelming majorities of almost every political party in the land, opposition and government, except for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, members of the Knesset. We will vote to say we reject a Palestinian state and we're putting all the resources to destroy it. That's the bias, that's the double standards that cannot be accepted. It's not enough to continue repeating two-state solution, two-state solution. What are you doing about the existential threat we face? Because when you hear the Israeli leaders, you have the impression we are occupying Israel, not Israel is occupying Palestine. You have the impression that they are facing an existential threat, not that we are facing an existential threat by the mass killing of our people and by the by stealing, by the fact our land is being stolen and our natural resources are being exploited. All things that the court analyzes very clearly. And therefore, we are faced with the existential threat, and that existential threat is posed by the continued Israeli occupation, by the negation of our existence as Palestinians, both within Israel borders and within the occupied Palestinian territory and the refugees. Israel denies that we have any rights as a collective, and they also violate our human rights as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about that, actually. I mean, on one level, obviously, this is, look, it's massive vindication. The highest court on earth has set out, in no uncertain terms, the most damning possible indictment of the Israeli occupation. It couldn't actually really have been much more damning of the Israeli occupation. It's as damning as it gets. And actually, I have to say, as I mentioned, I know there are some specialists on international law who are sympathetic and supportive of the Palestinian cause, but they were surprised at how far that the court went. On one level, that must be great, but on the other level, do you find it a bit kind of like, well, duh, you know, that it has to, that the obvious dynamics have to be pointed out? But is that useful? Because I suppose, I mean, it's particularly, look, I've worked in the Western media now for 13 long years, and, you know, you'll often have this portrayed by Western media outlets as, quote unquote, a conflict with a kind of implication that there are two sides, you know, of comparable weight, when what this ruling does is spell out in black and white the dynamics of the situation, that you have the occupier and you have the occupied, that this is colonization. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just wondering what you think about that, because on one level you must be like, well, this is a huge vindication, but on the other, is it just a case of, does it really take the, you know, the stark facts that you grew up with, that your lived experience, you know, defines your whole life, that it needs this to be spelt out? But is it good because then now, from now on, no one can dispute these dynamics?
It's a very important question, because what has happened, notably in recent months, is a confusion between the debate over the justness of the means and the justice of the cause. When you are fighting for liberation, not all means are justified. There are rules that apply to both the occupying power and the occupied people regarding the means that they are using. There are restrictions, and there is a protection of innocent civilians that apply across the board. And we are committed to these laws and these rules. But there's a big difference between the two parties when it comes to the justice of the cause. The colonial powers are always wrong to want to colonize a land, always. And people under colonization, under occupation, are always right to seek freedom. and liberation. So there shouldn't be a confusion about both partyism or this trying to draw a symmetry in a really asymmetric situation. It also, and that's very important in what the court says about security, it's reversing the order of things. It is saying that we need to provide for the security of our occupier that wants to remain our occupier. That's not the way it works. When you are peace partners with an occupying power that wants to end its occupation and a people who will become free, there's a logic to put in place arrangements that provide for the security of both sides. Allowing Israel to use that conditionality of security is effectively allowing it to perpetuate its occupation forever. You have now in the opposition in Israel, not only in power, you have fundamentalists in power who use religious texts to explain why they have the right to kill Palestinians. Again, whether Muslims, whether Christians, whether civilians, whether combatants, whether children, whether elderly, whether men, whether women, they're just killing Palestinians across the board without any regard for our lives or our rights. But in the opposition itself, you have people who tell you we have to keep the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is 1/3 of the West Bank. It's all where all our natural resources almost are, whether water, whether agriculture. It is our border with Jordan. And they tell you, but our security requires that we take it. Sorry. What does my security require? If every country can say, I need to take the land of my neighbor because I feel more secure once I do, what kind of rules are there? So it is very important to always never forget that while there are rules we all have to abide by, there's an occupying power and there's an occupied people, and they're not on the same level or the same footing, whether in front of history or in front of the law. And when you come to the charter and the right to self-determination and the prohibition on annexation, it is clear who has these obligations and who has these rights. I want to tell you about a Palestinian leader, if you allow me.
Please do.
Called Faisal Husseini from Jerusalem. He's an iconic figure for the Palestinian national struggle, maybe less well known than others in the international community. And he believed in the peaceful path. And to explain to people why I believe also very profoundly in that path, even though we still have to demonstrate that it would lead to liberation. That is the difficulty we are facing, to showcase that this political, legal, peaceful peaceful path would lead us to liberation. And to explain why he believed in it, Faisal Husseini used an image. He used to say, I can defeat Mike Tyson, but not by challenging him to the boxing ring, but to a chess game. And he thought that the peaceful path would expose Israel rather than bring us to its playing field, its favorite playing field, and the violence that it's able to exert in these situations. But I've always thought that there was a problem, a flaw in Faisal Husseini's presentation, regardless how powerful it was, how convincing it was. What happens if you sit to a chess game with Mike Tyson and you're on the verge of winning, which means getting to liberation, and Mike Tyson just throws the chess game to the floor and knocks out Faisal Husseini? What happens then? So Faisal Husseini, and that's what he did in reality, each time he was beaten all the way to the floor, even when he was an older man with health problems, and they used to beat him, Israeli police in Jerusalem, as he was fighting for Palestinian rights, he would get up and sit again, and you would have the chess game again. And when he was on the verge of winning, Mike Tyson would get up, throw the chess game, and knock him out once again. And if you're a Palestinian watching this scene time and time again, over and over again, there is a chance that a Palestinian youngster will tell himself, I'll take my chances at the boxing ring. Most probably I will not be able to win, but at least maybe I can inflict some injury on Mike Tyson. Maybe at least I can make him feel the cost of this exercise, rather than stupidly sit at a table, play a chess game, and get knocked out each time. The way we allow Faisal Husseini to prevail and his thinking to prevail, and I think that's in the interest of everyone, as we've seen in recent months, is to uphold the rules. is to force Mike Tyson to finish the game. It is to prevent him from knocking out the peaceful Faisal Hussein. And this is the occasion that this ICJ ruling provides. It reminds us all of the rules of the chess game. And if these rules are upheld, there will be national liberation for Palestine. But there will also be peace and security for all. It is in the best interest of Mike Tyson to restrain him in this situation. And it's in the best interest, of course, of the Palestinian people who are being beaten over and over again, harshly and brutally. But it's also in the best interest of finding peaceful solutions and allowing all to live, including all our children, to live in a peaceful world where they are not inflicted any harm. And this is the test now, because the judges, they did their work. They set the rules. You're right, people have lost a bit of their confidence and faith in these institutions, and therefore they thought that the judges will do politics. And the reason why people feel this is better than what they expected is because the judges did what they were mandated to do, which is to say what the law states with as much clarity as possible. They did the job. But saying the rules does not allow to enforce them. As I said, there's the ICJ or advisory opinion on the wall, and Israel continued building it. And already that opinion said settlements are illegal. Israel tripled the number of settlers since then. You have the resolutions of the Security Council for the last 50 years. You have General Assembly resolutions for the last 70. We have the Charter that guarantees our rights that were denied and dismissed and destroyed. So it's not about just stating the law, it's about enforcing the law. And that's where the ruling also is important, because it speaks of third-party responsibility.
Well, that's one of the just a couple of final questions, and that's one of them. In terms of the duties this imposes on, for example, the United States of America, on Britain, on those countries, what that's the kind of crucial kind of tell us about that part of the judgment and what the responsibilities, the legal responsibilities that those countries have.
Can I just read some excerpts before we go into that? Just
please do.
So those who are watching this are aware of what the court said itself as its main determinations. The court considers that the violations by Israel of the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force and of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination have a direct impact on the legality of the continued presence of Israel as an occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory. The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful. This illegality relates to the entirety of the Palestinian territory occupied by Israel in 1967. This is the territorial unit across which Israel has imposed policies and practices to fragment and frustrate the ability of the Palestinian people to exercise its right to self-determination, and over a large swath of which it has extended Israeli sovereignty in violation of international law. The entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory is also the territory in relation to which the Palestinian people should be able to exercise its right to self-determination, the integrity of which must be respected. You cannot make it clearer than that. When you speak of third-party responsibility, first, there's the responsibility of Israel, and it's very clear. And again, this is the court saying Israel has an obligation to put an end to its occupation as rapidly as possible. So if I need to quote, Israel has an obligation to bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. It also has an obligation to reparation for all the damages it has inflicted. And imagine if Israel had to pay for the damage it had caused to the Palestinians in 1948, in 1967, since for the last 57 years. Do you think it would be destroying Gaza at such a scale? Israel considers, I destroy, and the rest of the world needs to manage reconstruction, and then I destroy again. They destroy UN-funded projects in the West Bank and they destroy UN infrastructure in Gaza. They've destroyed universities and hospitals and homes. 70% of the homes were destroyed or damaged in the Gaza Strip. This large-scale destruction is only made possible because Israel never had to pay, neither politically nor financially, for the destruction and the devastation it has caused. So that's an important element to see if we can uphold that. As for the other states, and I want us to be, very clear about what these elements means. Member states are under obligation not to recognize any changes in the physical character or demographic composition, institutional structure, or status of the territory occupied by Israel. You cannot accept or endorse this annexation of territory, these changes through settlements, forcible transfer, etc., etc., except as agreed by the parties through negotiations. So therefore, only the Palestinians can accept something. As long as we don't accept it and we don't accept these changes that Israel has made, the rest of the international community has to stop these changes. The court says that Israel needs to evacuate all the settlers and dismantle all the settlements. You cannot use the fact that you've transferred these people there and now say, okay, I need new borders to accommodate them and I need more to do for their security. They're not supposed to be there in the first place. If they are not there, you don't need your soldiers there. You don't need to invent reasons for your checkpoints. You don't need to build roads for them. You don't need to steal our resources for their purposes. It says that third states should abstain from treaty relations with Israel in all cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the occupied Palestinian territory. So all treaties should be clear that beyond 67, Israel has no rights and should have no existence beyond the 67 borders. That becomes Palestine. To abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territory or parts thereof, which may entrench its unlawful presence in the territory. To abstain in the establishment and maintenance of diplomatic missions in Israel from any recognition of its illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the court says earlier that this applies to considering Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That violates international law. And to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel. This relates to trade with settlements or trade that goes to the benefit of the army and its presence of the occupying forces and their presence on our land. This could apply to trade in arms. This could apply to settlement products which are sold in European markets. What does it mean to just label a product? It comes from a settlement. You're allowing the settlements to benefit from that trade, and then you're saying the consumer can make a decision. No, states have a responsibility before the consumer, which is to ban these settlement products. I'll give you a number. The UNCTAD, the UN Development Agency, Trade and Development, considered that it estimated that settlements bring in $30 billion a year to the Israeli economy. $30 billion a year. This is the only occupation in the world that has all benefit, no cost. Why would they end it? Instead of paying the price for colonizing our land, they steal our resources and they sell them in European markets. It's unheard of. Instead of holding people accountable, they are punishing the Palestinian population. Instead of being punished for settling the land and exerting violence against the Palestinians, we start seeing now, 57 years later, a few settlers, individual settlers, being punished. You should punish the government that is sending these settlers, that is protecting these violent settlers and encouraging them and inciting them and arming them. So this is where it will be decisive to see if states can show the necessary political will to uphold the law and to restrain Israel and to stop this long history of terrible violations and of crimes. And the court says, of course, these same obligations apply to the UN, but it adds that the modalities to end the occupation, it's for the General Assembly, the Security Council, to take the responsibility in deciding of any additional measure required to bring it to an end and of the modalities to bring an end to the occupation. It also says that if you're a high contracting party of the Geneva Conventions, you need to uphold the convention. It also says that all states should cooperate to help bring the occupation to an end and to support the right of the Palestinians to self-determination. We consider that includes the recognition of the state of Palestine. That's one of the elements that is cooperating in order to uphold our right to self-determination that has been considered as a fundamental right, or again reasserted as a fundamental right by the court.
Just my final question, and that was a brilliant, detailed explanation, and people can see why you excel at your job as a diplomat, and the Palestinian delegation obviously very lucky to have you. But I just want to end by asking you this. And it's quite a difficult question. In that, we're obviously talking about a belligerent occupation which goes back decades, and the suffering of the Palestinian people predates that, the Nakba of 1948, and the suffering before that as well. And in the last 3 months, we've seen some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, live streamed on a daily basis. Tens of thousands of innocent people suffocated under rubble, burned to death, many of them kids, babies having their limbs amputated without anesthetic, starvation, the ruin of the entire medical system. The fact I call it a genocide is irrelevant. What many leading genocide scholars have no doubt whatsoever that this is genocide. And of course, a case in the International Court of Justice, which is currently trying Israel on the allegation of Israel based on the case submitted by the state of South Africa. Some of the worst unimaginable atrocities live streamed on a daily basis. For those who have the inclination to seek out, they know what's happening. And yet at the same time, we've seen a dramatic shift in public attitudes in Western states. Sympathy for the Palestinian people, the Palestinian nation, has never been as big as it has been today. So I guess that's my question, really. Is amidst horror, which, I find it almost impossible to deal with, and I'm not Palestinian. This isn't the lived experience you have. I can't even begin to imagine how you cope with this. I just can't imagine it. Amidst that, do you have some hope and optimism that the tide is shifting, and that, yes, there's a lagging indicator here, but when you have polls showing that more Americans than not think genocide is taking place, that polls in America, where it was verboten to talk about Israel in critical terms for so long, that particularly amongst younger Americans, there has been a dramatic shift against the Israeli state. Do you have a hope that actually it might not be next week or next month or whenever, but too many people have heard things they can't unhear, seen things they can't unsee, read things they can't unread? This has had a profound impact on so many people who, if I'm going to be honest, and I read the comments on my YouTube channel and on my Twitter and elsewhere when I post these videos like this, people who before, and this isn't to disparage them, had never really thought about Palestine before, but now see it as one of the great issues of our time. Do you have that sense that actually they're going to lose this in the end? They are going to lose this, and that the tide will shift in your favor? What's your kind of sense?
So this was a moment of contrast, because we've waited for this moment for a while to see this court making such a determination. But you're also very conscious of this coming in a certain reality, terrifying reality, especially for our people in Gaza, for all our people, but especially in Gaza, where they have every reason to doubt that the law means anything anymore. I've used the expression, this is year zero in international law in Gaza. This is before any, it looks like before any rule has been enacted. You're speaking of killing civilians by thousands, having food a few meters away and letting them starve. You're speaking of bombing people in tents after they have escaped from one corner to the other within an open-air prison. You speak of some of the most horrifying scenes and practices that you can imagine on live TV, and of leaders who are talking to the leaders of the entire world almost normally. You know, the Israeli Prime Minister will be hosted by the Congress in a couple of days. So as much as for peoples around the world, this Israeli government, Israel, as it presently conducts itself, is a pariah state. As we have the solidarity and support of almost all the governments in the world, as we have the support and solidarity of, I think, all the peoples in the world, the fate of the Palestinian people has not fundamentally changed till now. And it has been going on for 100 years of fighting, of trying, of convincing. What we do here, there are moments when you have to wonder, does it have any bearing? Does it have any sense? We adopt Security Council General Assembly resolutions for a ceasefire, for stopping the indiscriminate killing, for stopping the organized famine of a nation of 2 million people. Organized, orchestrated famine that kills children in the worst way possible, when their organs tear themselves apart because they have nothing to eat. People dying of diseases that we had eradicated. Hospitals turned into cemeteries. Schools, universities, we are among the most educated populations in the world. It took a lot of effort for refugees in tents to impose that life of education and make it a cornerstone of our identity. An entire generation of Palestinians in Gaza was not able to go to school this year. None of this should have been possible. And it has to make us doubt. I have an answer which is not a satisfactory answer. Against all odds, I have faith. I cannot say it's hope. I cannot say it's analysis. I cannot say it's based on the trends that you're talking about, the new generation, etc., because I know there are forces that are able to sustain that kind of pressure, the popular pressure. I've seen in countries demonstrators for Palestine or for raising a Palestinian flag being beaten in terrible ways. I've seen the polemics and the controversies in some corners of the globe. While you have this overwhelming support that you can test in polls and in the general mood, and even that we can sense here when we speak and the whole room applauds, and when the Israeli representative speaks and everybody is disgusted by how he speaks of the Palestinians and with which disregard he addresses the world. Our role is not to win the argument, just to win the argument. Our role is to win the argument to change reality. And at that, we have all collectively failed. And this failure leads to despair and leads to actions that are also not the right ones. So I genuinely believe the Palestinian people will be free, but that's a belief. And I try to work, and we all are trying to do our part in making that happen. I believe that peace is not only possible, it is indispensable. It's just the reality. History has created this situation. Political forces have created the situation. And, some people want to reverse that situation, change the course of history as it was. And some of us are trying to ensure the freedom and the dignity of the Palestinian people within the reality that was created by these changes. And we were hoping that that would spare Palestinian life. So it is terrible to see that instead of having a Palestinian state next to Israel, both living in peace and security, you're having a genocide in Gaza. Instead of having a population flourish and thrive, they're still displacing communities. There's still settlers killing people in the streets. There's still Israeli army shooting people in full disregard. There's still settlements being built on our lands. There's still. So, what I can tell you is the following. This is a terrifying tragedy. I don't know how you recover from it, and our people are resilient, but nobody should have to demonstrate such a resilience. Our first duty is to put an end to it by all the means we have available to us. And then we have to make sure it never happens again. And to make sure that the Palestinian people are able to exist, to just be free, to just be live a dignified life in their land. That shouldn't take all this effort, all these lives, all these sacrifices, all this time. And we are hoping this is a turning point, that what's happening in Palestine, as you said, the whole world considers it is important for the future of the world, not only for the Palestinian people. What happened in the court, what's happening in every forum, that it will be the beginning of real change that people can observe. That is our duty for the ones who have lost their lives, for the ones who were killed, the Palestinians that were killed. And this is our duty for all those who remain alive and who will have to survive and who will have to face the reality the next day of the horrors they have endured, with at least the prospect that their children will not to have, that the children or their children's children will not have to face the same reality, that they can finally be free.
Beautifully put. And I don't think it's much consolation, obviously, given the horrors that you're up against, but there are so many who will never, ever, ever give up on their solidarity with the Palestinian people. And that includes so many people who, before this current genocidal onslaught began, would never have imagined that this was a cause that they would be championing. It's so important we elevate voices like your own. You've been such an eloquent exposition, grounded in fact, grounded in the law, which I think offers an incontrovertible case, which is obviously incontrovertible because we just had the International Court of Justice's opinion-based explaining what international law says in this context. It can't be easy to do the job that you're doing at the best of times, and this is the worst of times. But I think we're all in all listening to you of the job that you're doing in the circumstances that you're under. For those obviously watching, thanks so much as ever. Please press like and subscribe, But to you, Majed, thank you so much.
Can I just tell you one more thing? Sorry.
Yes, of course,
you had these kind words towards me. And I've seen a trend to consider those speaking out as the heroes of the story, and I believe that is a mistake. I come from a situation of privilege, notably now being in New York and being able to advocate for my country with a certain sense of security, relative but very existent compared to those on the ground. So there are heroes on the ground, and we learn often their names when they're killed. But there are many heroes, and we are only their echo. And that is the easiest part of the struggle. So I just seize this opportunity to salute those who have paid the price for conducting the hardest part of the struggle, which is to be in that situation and to continue striving for liberation, to continue striving for life. Doctors that continue to work in impossible situations, rescue workers who know that they have become targets, journalists, individuals, mothers trying to save their children, fathers trying to save their children, the neighbors trying to help each other, communities still standing tall in the face of great adversity. And thank you for giving us the chance to speak to the extent we can to raise their voices through ours.
Amen to that, and I couldn't agree with you more. Obviously, and those within Gaza who've, in the midst of an unimaginable genocidal onslaught, those doctors and nurses who've carried on their jobs in impossible circumstances, as every single hospital and medical facility has been destroyed. And of course, the journalists who've suffered the biggest slaughter of journalists in any conflict in human history. Just today, I was corresponding with a Palestinian journalist who's living in the ruins of what was Khan Yunis with his family, his brother killed, looking after his kids, as well as his brother's kids. And the work of those Palestinian journalists will be remembered throughout the ages. We wouldn't know about the vast majority of what we know, the horrors have been committed, without the lions of the World Press Pack, the journalists of Gaza, many of whom have been slaughtered alongside their families. And we should always, of course, pay tribute. So I'm glad you made that point. Thank you so much, Majed. It's been such an honor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.